Okay, hello everybody. So this week we're going to be working on some skills in logic and argumentation. These are really important skills for doing philosophy well. Just to recall from last time, philosophy is all about asking whether we have good reasons for holding our beliefs. And in order to give good reasons for holding our beliefs, and in order to evaluate the question of whether other philosophers have good reasons for holding their beliefs, is we want to look at whether these philosophical views offer arguments in favor of those views. So when we're thinking about questions in ethics, oftentimes what we're asking is, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for moral rightness or wrongness? We're going to get into the details of what it means for a condition to be necessary or sufficient in a little bit. But basically what we're asking is, what does it take in order for an action to count as doing the right thing, or for an action to count as doing the wrong thing? So we always have to ask ourselves, is there an argument here in favor of a particular view or against a particular view in ethics? And what we're also going to see in this little logic review this week is that not all arguments are equally good. So what I want to teach you to do this week is to look at how to separate a good argument from a bad one. And I'm going to do this by giving you a certain kind of vocabulary for thinking about differences between different sorts of arguments. And moreover, I'm going to help you identify the differences between those good arguments and bad arguments. So this is just going to be a really important tool in your toolkit as somebody starting out learning how to think like a philosopher. So what is an argument? Well, the basic idea is that an argument is a series of premises that works in support of a conclusion. So the idea here is that a premise is just a statement, right? But it's a statement that leads us to a conclusion. So here's a well-known and classic argument. It goes back to the ancient Greeks. It says this: all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, and therefore Socrates is mortal. So the thought here is that we have two statements that leads us to a third statement. Here's a second one. This is my dog right here, my dog, Bo. So here's the first statement, our first premise. If Bo is a dog, then Bo is a mammal. 2, Bo is a dog. 3, so, therefore, Bo is a mammal. So these are arguments, and these are actually good arguments. So we're going to talk about why these count as good arguments in a little while. Sometimes you'll see an argument laid out in this sort of premise, conclusion form. But sometimes when you're reading a textbook, it's just going to be a big block of text, some prose. But you can sort of watch out for arguments when you see a philosopher use words like therefore, so, thereby, or thus, right? So when we see these therefore words, or so, that means that this person is saying, well, we've got one statement here which leads us to accept another statement. So it's a kind of logical reasoning. So now we want to think about the question, what makes an argument a good argument? Now, I told you that these ones are good arguments. Well, what's so good about them? Well, so here's what philosophers are looking for in a good argument. There's a couple of features that they want. They want flawless reasoning, and they want true premises. So the idea here is that when we look for flawless reasoning in an argument, we're looking for an argument that has premises that fit together in the right kind of ways, right? If you don't have flawless reasoning, then we can say, yeah, I accept premise 1 and I accept premise 2, but premise 3 does not follow from premise 1 and premise 2. If your reasoning is flawless, you're not going to have that problem, right? So you're going to have premises that fit together in the right way to guarantee the truth of your conclusion. The other thing that we're going to look for is true premises. So not only will the argument have a good structure, that is, not only will it have premises that lead to a true conclusion, or a conclusion that would be true, we actually have premises that are in fact true, so that when we fit them together in the right way, you're actually going to get an actually true conclusion. So in order to describe both flawless reasoning and an argument with true premises, philosophers have a couple of technical terms. Now, the words that philosophers use to describe flawless reasoning and true premises are words, as you'll see, that we use in ordinary language all the time. But we want to notice that when we're reading a philosophy paper or in the philosophy classroom, we're going to use these words in a very specialized technical sense. It's kind of similar to how your math teachers might use the word number in a very specific, specialized way, or the way that your physics teacher might use the word weight in a different way than most people ordinarily talk about it. So for instance, when we talk about weight, usually we're just talking about how big something is, that it weighs 100 pounds. But, in the physics classroom, that word is going to mean how much it pulls down on the ground, right? And when we talk about something being 100 pounds, that's actually for the word mass, if you see what I mean there, right? So we just have to be very careful with how we use certain words within certain academic contexts, right? So philosophy reserves a couple of words for talking about arguments in a very specific way. So here's the first thing that we say. An argument, one of its features is validity. So some arguments are valid, and they're valid when the truth of the premises would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Now, of course, not all arguments have true premises, but we're saying, look, if we assume the truth of the premises of the argument, does the conclusion follow? Right? So that's our first special concept. And this is a concept that relates to flawless reasoning. Now, our second big concept is a sound argument. So a sound argument is one that is valid, but it has an additional feature. The additional feature is not only does the argument have a structure such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion would have to be true. We additionally say that a sound argument has all and only true premises, right? So, as Schaefer-Landau says it in your textbook, a sound argument is basically the gold standard of arguments, right? Because it has flawless reasoning, it has true premises, and because it has this awesome structure and all true premises, the conclusion in a sound argument is guaranteed to be true. We might ask ourselves, Why is it impossible for an argument to be sound, but also invalid? Well, in order to answer that question, we just have to look at the definitions of our terms, right? So validity is a good structure. If we ask whether an argument is valid, we're asking, would the conclusion be true if all the premises are true, right? But the definition of a sound argument is a valid argument with all true premises. If you thought about this in terms of a Venn diagram, you'd have a little circle with the sound arguments and then a big circle that completely encapsulates that other circle with the valid arguments, right? Because soundness is validity plus all truth. So a sound argument is really a valid argument with the additional special feature of having only true premises. So let's keep thinking about this first feature of validity. So when we're talking about an argument being valid, we're actually not yet talking about whether or not its conclusion is true, right? We're just talking about whether the premises fit together in the right way. So just to state this again, when an argument is valid, it means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion would have to be true, or it's guaranteed to be true, right? And for the premises to guarantee the conclusion, the premises have to fit together in the right way. So one good tip-off of an invalid argument is when the premises don't have anything to do with the conclusion. Or you get to the conclusion and all of a sudden there's like a new concept that's being introduced into the conclusion that the premises had nothing to do with. So we can say that if an argument is invalid, you're going to be able to say, we can grant the truth of all the premises of your argument, but your conclusion might still be false. And if you can say that about an argument, then it's just not valid, because it would seem that the truth of the premises isn't guaranteeing the truth of the conclusion. So let's try some example cases. Let's look at this one. Chicago is north of Boston. 2, Boston is north of Charleston. 3, therefore Chicago is north of Charleston. So when we're asking whether an argument is valid, what we're just asking is, if we assume 1 to be true and we assume 2 to be true, would it have to be the case that 3 is true? Well, when we say that like one thing is north of another thing, it's also going to be north of everything that that other thing is north of, right? So we can like try to think about this like on a map. So if we think about Chicago being north of Boston, so we're going to have Chicago above Boston and Boston being north of or above Charleston, then it does actually seem that Chicago up here would have to be north of Charleston down there. So just by thinking about how these premises fit together, it does seem that the truth of 1 and 2 is a guarantee of 3. So we're going to say that this one, we would give a check. We would say that's a valid argument. Now, remember, validity and soundness are separate things. I know for sure that Boston is north of Charleston. I'd actually have to get an atlas or Wikipedia out to figure out whether Chicago is north of Boston. And if we were to confirm that, by looking at latitudinal coordinates, then if we get the truth on that premise, then that would make it not only a valid argument, but also a sound one, right? We know that the reasoning is flawless here, we'd have to do a little more research to see if it has all true premises. Let's look at another argument. This one says, witches are made of wood, wood floats, therefore witches float. This is sort of a weird, fanciful argument. If you don't believe in witches, you might even say, well, like, that's kind of a weird one. You know, like there aren't any true statements about witches. But again, when we're looking at validity, we're just saying what happens when we suppose one and suppose two. And we say, okay, so let's assume that witches are made of wood, and two, that wood floats. Does that guarantee three? This one is actually tricky. Now, if we say that it depends on what we mean by premise two, if it's just that some things made out of wood float, then that could be the case that there are certain kinds of wood that will sink. And then we could say, actually, this isn't a valid argument, because just because wood floats in general doesn't mean every single thing made of wood floats. Now, if we were to say that witches are made of wood, anything that is wooden or made of wood, or just a piece of wood, will float, then that would guarantee the truth of our conclusion. So that one's tricky, right? But again, we just have to think about, well, what would it actually take for the conclusion to be false? And we can say, well, it depends on how we read premise two in this argument. But the thought should still be that if we can find a way of saying, well, if one is true and two is true, then three is true, then we've got a valid argument. If we can find a way of saying, assume one, assume two, but we could still imagine that three is false, then we've got an invalid argument. Let's look at some more. Elizabeth owns either a Honda or a Saturn. 2, Elizabeth does not own a Honda, therefore Elizabeth owns a Saturn. What do we think of this one? Well, again, when we're testing for validity, we're just saying, would the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion? So we're supposed to assume the truth of one and assume the truth of two. Does that get us 3? Well, what we got to think about here is what's going on with an either-or statement. Well, with an either-or statement, when they're true, we're saying either one half of the statement is true or the other half of the statement is true, right? So we're saying either it's the case that she owns a Honda or that Elizabeth owns a Saturn. But then the second premise says that she doesn't own a Honda. Well, that means that the only way for both of these two to be true is sort of like the scenario in which she owns a Saturn, right? So that actually does get us to the conclusion. Now, if we want to get a little bit more technical, what's going on here is a philosophical move called disjunction elimination, right? A disjunction is just a this or that statement. But what we say is, if we say X or Y, not X, we can be logically guaranteed that if both of those statements are true, then Y has to be true, right? So we're saying X or Y, not X, therefore Y. Let's try another. All right. All toasters are items made of gold. All items made of gold are time travel devices. 3, therefore, all toasters are time travel devices. Now this one, all these statements are ridiculous, right? I have a toaster in my kitchen. I can assure you it is not a time travel device. I can also assure you that it's not made of gold, right? But when we're looking at validity, again, we're just looking for structure. So here we're going to say, well, assume 1 and assume 2. that if you've got a toaster, then it must be made of gold, and all things made of gold are time travel devices. Well, that would actually get us the truth of this conclusion, right? That if you have a toaster, you can be assured that it's a time travel device. Now, if you're not seeing this yet, you might try to draw this in terms of a Venn diagram, right? So it would be like your category, which is the toasters, would be fully encapsulated within the category things made of gold, right? And then the second one says all things made of gold fall into the category time travel devices, right? And if the time travel devices contains all the gold things, and if all of the toasters are contained within the gold category, then that actually does get us our conclusion. All right, let's move on. Here's the second feature of a good argument. Remember, we said that in order to have a good argument, it's going to have a good structure. It's also going to have true premises and a true conclusion. Well, remember, we all already saw what it is for an argument to be valid. It's well structured, such that if we assume the truth of the premises, then the conclusion follows. Well, when we say sound, we're saying it's valid, so it's got good structure, plus all true premises. And that means that every sound argument has a conclusion that's guaranteed to be true. So let's keep looking at particular arguments. This one says, 1, all tigers are mammals. 2, no mammals are creatures with scales. And 3, therefore, no tigers are creatures with scales. Well, let's see. All tigers are mammals. That seems true. 2, no mammals are creatures with scales. That seems true to me. Like, all the animals I can think of with scales are things like fish and lizards. I'm thinking maybe armadillos might count, but that is a tricky one. I don't think that the stuff on an armadillo's back are really scales. So let's just set that aside for a second. 3, therefore, no tigers are creatures with scales. Well, if we assume 1 and we assume 2, then we're going to say, like, look, none of the things within the mammal category have scales, right? That's exactly what premise 2 says. And then we're going to say that, like, anything that's a tiger is going to be a mammal. Well, that actually would get us the conclusion then, right? If 1 is true and 2 is true, then it's impossible for a tiger to be a creature with scales. Now, the question about whether the argument is sound is going to depend on whether we grant or whether it actually is true that premise 2 is true. And that's going to depend on, like, whether the stuff on an armadillo's back are scales. If those things aren't scales, then premise 2 is true. And then we have an argument that's both valid and sound. Let's look at another. All spider monkeys are elephants. No elephants are animals. Therefore, no spider monkeys are animals. Okay. So when we look for validity, we're saying assume 1 to be true. So all the spider monkeys are elephants and no elephants are animals. Well, that does seem to say, therefore, no spider monkeys are animals. So if we think about that, 1 and 2 fit together in a certain way that guarantees that if these were true, then 3 would also have to be true. So we got a valid argument. Then we ask, is this argument sound? Well, then we're asking, not only is it valid, but does it also have only true premises? Well, if we can find a false premise, then the argument is unsound. Well, 1 and 2 are both clearly false, right? Spider monkeys and elephants are just different kinds of things. Moreover, all elephants are animals. So here we have a valid argument, clearly, but it's also clearly an unsound argument. And remember, it's impossible to have an argument which is sound but not valid, because soundness isn't just about all true premises, but it's also about all true premises with a good valid structure. So just to think about it this way, soundness is validity plus truth. Let's work through a few more cases. I've got your definitions at the side right here, just so you can think this through. 1, if all dogs are mammals, then all dogs are reptiles. 2, all dogs are mammals. 3, therefore all dogs are reptiles. So we say, assume 1 is true, and then assume 2 is true. If you think about it, 3 actually does follow. So we've got a valid argument here, but the argument is unsound, right? Because premise 1 is false. It's not true that if a dog is a mammal, that would make them all reptiles. Here's another one. Either disciplining people is always wrong, or it's not always wrong to discipline people for committing crimes. 2, disciplining people hurts them. 3, disciplining people is always wrong. So think about that one for a second. So what you want to do is you want to ask yourself, you want to do what this blue box is telling you to do, right? So the blue box is saying, look, imagine all the premises are true, and if it's impossible for the conclusion to be false, then the argument is valid. Now, if it's possible for the conclusion to be false, then the argument is invalid. So here's the thing to notice about premise 1. Premise 1 says either disciplining people is wrong or it's not wrong. This is one of these statements that we can actually notice is a tautology. So a tautology just means a statement that is just true in terms of the words that it has in it. If you understand the words in this statement, we're saying like, look, either disciplining people is wrong or it's not wrong. It's actually kind of impossible to deny the truth of this sentence because it covers all the logical possibilities, right? We're going to say like, look, either you have exactly $900 in your bank account or you don't, right? That covers all logical possibilities. And here's the second premise. Disciplining people hurts them, right? But this is actually a pretty uncontroversial statement, right? We would think that, well, disciplining people is sort of like, by definition, something that's like unpleasant. If it wasn't unpleasant, it wouldn't really be discipline, right? So then we have to ask ourselves, if premise 1 is true and if premise 2 is true, does that make premise 3 true all the time? We would say actually, maybe not, right? Because we might imagine, look, it's possible for disciplining people to hurt them, but sometimes it's okay to discipline a person. Well, remember, premise 1 leaves that possibility open. So we could say, look, it's possible that the way that 1 is true is that sometimes it's okay to discipline people. 2, we grant that, yeah, disciplining people sometimes hurts them. But 3, we would say, like, look, even if we assume 1 and 2 to be true, premise 3, our conclusion, doesn't have to be true, right? So we're saying, like, look, it is possible for the conclusion to be false even when we assume premise 1 and premise 2. So the argument is invalid. And because soundness is validity plus all true premises, it can't be a sound argument either. Now that's interesting because even though premise 1 is true and premise 2 is almost certainly true, it's not a sound argument because it doesn't have a valid structure in addition. A couple more cases. Let's look at this first one. Anyone who lives in Greensboro also lives in Guilford County. So there we're saying, like, look, to live in Greensboro is also to live in Guilford County. Just like living in Guilford County guarantees that you also live in North Carolina, right? Premise 2, right? We're going to say 1,236 people named Jeff live in Guilford County. So 3, therefore, 1,236 people named Jeff live in Greensboro. Now, what do we want to say about this argument? Now, 1, we've actually thought about it for a second and we've said, look, that actually has to be true. Just like when you think about the relationship between living in Greensboro and living in Guilford County. So it's not hard to assume the truth of that premise. Premise 2, 1,236 people named Jeff live in Guilford County. When we think about that, we're saying, okay, let's just assume it. We don't actually know whether this is true, or at least we'd have to do a lot of detailed research on census records. But we can suppose that this is true, right? We can imagine a possible world in which 1,236 people named Jeff live in the county. Then we look at 3. Therefore, that same number of people named Jeff live in Greensboro. What's going to happen here? We're going to say, well, assume 1 to be true and assume 2 to be true. Is it possible for 3 to be false? Try to think about that for yourself. Now, the way that I think about this is that this argument is invalid because it's possible for 1 to be true and 2 to be true, but for 3 to be false. Now, let me explain to you why it's possible for 3 to be false, right? It's because, yeah, if you live in Greensboro, then you definitely live in Guilford County, right? And it's possible that some of the people named Jeff living in Guilford County don't live in Greensboro, right? Some of them might live in Jamestown, some of them might live in High Point, and so on, right? But if that's the case, then we might say, well, the way that it's possible for 1 to be true and 2 to be true is that, yeah, everybody who lives in Greensboro is also living in Guilford. There are 1,236 Jeffs in Guilford. But, let's say exactly 1,000 of them live in Greensboro, and the other 236, while they live in Guilford County, are living in High Point and Jamestown, right? So this argument has a problem with its structure, right? 1 and 2 does not guarantee the truth of 3. Let's look at this one. 1, Barack Obama was either the 41st or the 38th U.S. president. 2, Obama was not the 38th U.S. president. So 3, Obama was the 41st U.S. president. So remember, the first thing that we want to do is we want to test for validity, right? So we're going to say, let's assume that 1 is true and assume that 2 is true. Would that guarantee that 3 is true? Well, we say, this is one of those disjunction elimination statements again. So we say, look, either Obama was 41 or Obama was 38. And then, we just assume that Obama wasn't the 38th. And we conclude from that Obama was number 41. So again, with this one, we're saying X or Y. We've eliminated the possibility of X, or we've eliminated the possibility of Y in this case, therefore X. So we imagine 1 to be true, we imagine 2 to be true, and then we realize the more you think about it, the more we can see that it's impossible for 3 to be false, assuming 1 and 2, right? So within that scenario, we have a valid argument. But then we say, look, sound arguments have good structure and true premises. They are valid, plus none of their premises are false. Well, I can tell you straight away that 2 is true. Obama was not the 38th US president. I looked it up a minute ago, and the 38th US president was Gerald Ford. So we've got a valid argument. Premise 2 is true. Then we have to ask, is premise 1 true? Well, in fact, it's not, right? So if you know your trivia and you know your history well enough, you'll know that George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., was number 41. And you might also just know off the top of your head that Barack Obama was the 44th president of the US. So we've got a valid argument here, but one of the premises is false. Premise 1 is false. So it's a valid but unsound argument. So the reasoning here is good. It's just that it's reasoning from a false premise. Let's just keep working through these. You should keep watching if you just want to make sure that you're following the concepts. So here's our first one. Lying is always done intentionally. 2, lying is often a sign of disrespect. 3, therefore, lying is morally wrong. So here we want to ask, is the argument valid, right? Does it have a good structure? So we would say all right, let's assume that lying is always done intentionally. You can't lie by accident. Okay. We assume 2, lying is often a sign of disrespect. Okay, so, we can think about what that statement means and what it would take for it to be true. And then 3, therefore, lying is always morally wrong. Try to think of whether you could grant all the premises to be true, just assume them to be true, and then think to yourself, can you imagine the conclusion being false? If it's impossible to get a false conclusion from those 2 premises, then we've got a valid argument. But here, we should notice that, maybe even sometimes when we intentionally lie, and even if that's sometimes a sign of disrespect, maybe it's still okay to sometimes lie, right? If you could lie in order to prevent a murder, right? So then the thought would be, this is not a valid argument. Another sort of bell that should go off in your head when you're looking at this argument is you can notice that the concept of morally wrong doesn't show up until the conclusion, right? So we haven't seen that there's any conceptual guarantee between doing things intentionally, doing things that are disrespectful, whether that gets us all the way to moral wrongness. So this argument is invalid, and because soundness is validity plus truth, it's also going to be unsound. Let's look at the next one. It says, if an animal can fly, it's a bug. Bats can fly. Therefore, bats are bugs. So you can already tell that the conclusion of this argument is absurd, right? Bats are not bugs. Everybody knows this. So now we've got to figure out, like, what's going on with this argument? What's up with it, right? Well, we can ask first about validity, right? We say, if it flies, then it's a bug. Well, like, just assume that to be true, right? You think the only things that fly are bugs when they're animals. Bats can fly, therefore bats are bugs. Now, if we assume 1 and we assume 2, actually 3 would have to be true. Because it seems that if we're really taking seriously and assuming premise 1 and granting premise 2, then 3 would also have to be true, right? So this is a valid argument, but it's not a sound argument. And what we can say here is, like, look, premise 2 is pretty obviously true. We all know that bats can fly. But we also know that this if an animal can fly, then it's a bug statement is obviously false. The easiest thing to come up with would be something like birds. Birds are not bugs, but they can fly, right? So we've come up with an example of something that can fly, but which is not a bug. And we're going to talk about this skill of finding counterexamples to conditionals in another video that I'm going to produce for you. But obviously, you can see the falsity of this premise. So even though this is a valid argument, it's got good structure. There's nothing wrong with the reasoning here. It's still going to be unsound because it's reasoning from a false premise. Okay, so to recap on this section, an argument is valid if it has a good structure, such that the truth of the premises would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Now, at this point, we're not saying one way or the other when we're talking just about validity, whether the premises are true, but we're saying if we assume the premises to be true, when you've got a valid argument, then the conclusion would have to be true once we assume the truth of the premises. And then our second feature is soundness, right? So an argument is sound if it's valid and additionally has only true premises. So make sure that you're following the reasoning on the examples that we worked through. And if you have any questions or concerns, you can double check the textbook, but you can also get in touch with me. Thanks.